welcome to this week's Club Zone video. This week we're going to be exploring how clubs can make their activities as inclusive as possible and ensure they're not inadvertently discriminating against some of their members. To help me navigate this topic, I'm joined by Joff McGill, who's the RYA Sailability Manager. Welcome, Joff.
Hi there, Gareth. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Good. Looking forward to talking about this one.
Excellent.
So we know that clubs have been working really hard on this and trying to restart activities in some difficult circumstances. And they've been trying to restart as safely as possible and of course, protect their membership. Equally, many people remain concerned about the risk of contracting the virus, both because they may be at higher risk of serious illness if they do catch COVID-19, but also due to any difficulties they may have in observing social distancing. So for me, it's really important that planned return to boating is inclusive and that clubs don't unintentionally end up discriminating against particular groups within their membership.
I think that's right, Gareth, and I can absolutely understand how this can happen. You know, our focus throughout this pandemic has been on protecting people, and if there are people who are at higher risk of serious illness, we don't want to put them in harm's way at all. What we have seen is a few clubs have a blanket policy of asking everybody over 70, for example, to stay away from the club. Or we've heard a few assumptions that just because somebody is disabled, they must be part of a vulnerable group. You know, and potentially this is discriminatory. You know, while we've got some new regulations around at the moment because of COVID-19 that we have to meet, but clubs still have got that legal duty to ensure the decisions they make don't directly or indirectly discriminate against employees, customers, members who've got any protected characteristic. Those protected characteristics, if you remember, are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnerships, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. So what we're doing is advising against any blanket policy that contain age or disability restrictions, for example.
Yeah, good. It makes sense, doesn't it? And there is that potential to inadvertently discriminate against individuals with those protected characteristics due to that perception of their risk profile. And there's all sorts of terminology that's come out over the last couple of months around that, and terms that are being used to describe those who are at higher risk. And I don't know if you could try and explain some of those for us, Joff.
I can try, and you know, I think it's important to try to do so because there are definitely some misunderstandings around. What we know is that the virus can make anyone seriously ill, but for some people the risk is higher. And the government and the NHS have highlighted two levels of higher risk. They've talked about people who are clinically vulnerable, either described as higher risk or sometimes moderate risk, depending on the guidance that you read. So we've got people who are clinically vulnerable. And then the second group, who are at the highest risk, are people who are clinically extremely vulnerable. Now, one of the important things to remember is that the lists you'll see on the NHS and government website may not include everybody who's at higher risk, and they may change as we learn more about the virus. So it's important to stay up to date for all of us, really. But let me explain those terms a little. So people who are clinically vulnerable include anyone who's age 70 or over. It includes pregnant women, it includes people who've got diabetes, and a range of other health conditions that are listed on both the NHS and government sites. The advice for this group is to stay at home as much as possible, but they can go out for work, and if they can't work from home, and they can go out for things like getting food or exercising. So if you do go out, the advice is to pay particular attention to minimizing contact with others and make sure that you're staying at least 2 meters away from people that you don't currently live with. The advice for people who are clinically extremely vulnerable is slightly different. They will have received a letter from the NHS and been advised to take a whole host of extra steps to protect themselves. And generally, this has been called shielding. People who are shielding can spend time outdoors now, but there is a lot that they need to do to protect themselves, and they will be receiving that information all of the time.
That really helps. It's a bit of a minefield, isn't it? So thank you. I mean, the other thing I'm curious about is what responsibilities do clubs have for people who are at higher risk? You know, one of those definitions that you just helped clarify for us there.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Clubs are all, you know, I'm involved in lots of clubs myself. You know, we're always worried about our responsibilities. And as soon as a club makes its facilities and services available to its members, or as soon as it organises any sort of activity, it has a duty of care to everybody who's involved. And if the risks are higher for those participants and everyone involved, then the duty of care shifts as well. You know, we've been exploring this for weeks through these forums and these videos and other ways. The best way to meet that duty of care is to go through a step-by-step process to confirm what's permitted, assess the risk, decide on how you're going to mitigate against that risk, put in place all the policies and procedures that you need, and then tell all your members about this is what we're doing to try and make the activity as safe as possible. And I guess at that point, it's then for members themselves to assess what the club's doing and how they're going about doing it, and based on their own personal situation and their own personal acceptance of the risk involved, decide whether they want to participate or not. It's fair to say that some people in the high risk groups won't want to come back to boating straight away. They'll want to continue staying at home as much as possible, but some people may want to. They may just find it harder to get back into boating and may need a little bit more support. You know, I was talking to one club this week, one sailability group this week, and they said they've been talking to their sailors, and they had, you know, extremes of examples. They had one sailor who'd been advised by their doctor that if they did catch COVID, it may well have incredibly serious complications and consequences for them. And there was another sailor saying, look, I've been going out shopping all through lockdown for my essentials, and actually I consider going shopping and meeting people in the shops a much greater risk level than going for a sail. And I think both of those positions are entirely understandable for individuals to take, and clubs will need to understand and respect and support both members in that situation. So it's really important to make sure we don't have those blanket policies that further exclude people, further isolate people, and that we've thought about what we can do, because if we don't think about how we can be inclusive and how we can provide some extra support for people who need it, we won't plan for it, and it won't happen.
So Joff, what are the good examples of inclusivity that you've seen recently in clubs, and what are these clubs doing? How are they making a difference?
Yeah, there are some great examples out there, but it's important to remember that all the measures that clubs put in place so people can protect themselves are really, really important for those people who need that extra support to get active again and to get outside again. So all the measures around enabling people to wash their hands regularly, to clean equipment and surfaces, all the measures to keep people 2 meters apart. If these work, they're going to help protect people who are at high risk, along with everybody else as well. So they're really, really important. We've seen some clubs offer priority booking slots at times when they're able to control the numbers of their club at an even lower level than they might do on other days of the week. So those kind of priority booking slots for people who need extra support, who may be at higher risk, have been really important. We've seen other clubs, the online engagement and the constant communication with members is really, really important to help build people's confidence in the measures that the club have put in place to maintain contact and maintain engagement. So I think all of that stuff is also really important. You know, I've seen a sailability group have a phone service where they've been calling all of their members regularly to check how they're doing and what they're thinking and, you know, what they want to do next. And I guess it's important to remember that just because some of us can restart boating and we're seeing lots of people on the water, which is fantastic, actually looking after all of our members remains really important, because we want them all to come back at some point. I can also think it's possible to put in place some socially distant volunteer support to help people at some stage, maybe particularly around getting people and boats in and out of the water. And I'm looking forward to seeing some examples of clubs who are able to put in that kind of socially distant volunteer support. And it's also important to remember that some members might have a usual carer, or they might have a member of their household who can help, and then they can offer that support to help people get in and out of boats, even if that means being closer than 2 meters. So that's an important part that clubs can think about. You know, and I guess that there might be some support that's required for disabled sailors that we can't offer yet due to the current social distancing requirements. You know, if you need to hoist somebody into a boat or provide physical support, it may well not be possible to do that and maintain 2 metre social distance. Blind or visually impaired people will need guiding and supporting around a boat, and that may not be possible at the moment. We know lots of groups who actually, getting themselves to the club on transport has proved difficult. Deaf people are really struggling with communication at the moment. If everyone's wearing face coverings, communication becomes really difficult, and autistic people the same. If people are wearing face coverings, it's even harder for people to read the sense of what people are trying to say. And we know lots of activity happens with buddy sailors and volunteers sitting alongside someone in a boat, and clearly that's not possible at the moment. So there's lots of support that is required that might not be possible, but there is lots of support that is possible as well.
Joff, that all makes sense, but how is not providing that support not discriminatory?
Well, what I talked about there was some of the support that might not be possible given social distancing, and it's true generally anyway, but certainly during the pandemic, it may be necessary to treat a person less favourably, and provided such a treatment can be objectively justified, it may not be unlawful. So on safety grounds, you may not, or on the grounds of the amount of physical support somebody would need to go sailing and the inability to maintain 2 metre social distancing, you wouldn't be able to meet those social distancing requirements, and it wouldn't be in the best interest of that person to go sailing or to take that risk. So it might well be in that case that you are, by the spirit of the law, you're discriminating against someone, but you can objectively justify it. So it's probably not going to be unlawful. Does that help?
Yeah, that does help. And I suppose the message to clubs is, if you want further clarity on that, if you've got a specific example, do please email us at legal@rya.org.uk, and the team there will be able to help you.
So, Gareth, I think one of the important things to remember is that people have had very different experiences during lockdown. And if we're planning on making a return to boating inclusive, we need to understand this and to an extent be careful about some of the language we use. I'm joined now by an old colleague of mine, Rosemary Frazer, who tells me she has been sailing, used to sail quite a lot. Hi there, Rosemary.
Hello.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the sailing you did.
So, well, going way back, we used to sail a lot at school. On sort of smaller boats and that as sort of part of our PE sessions and things. So that was fun. But then I later on sailed to Calais and back with the Jubilee Sailing Trust on the Admiral Nelson, or the Lord Nelson. I was getting the name mixed up. So I'm fairly familiar with sort of sailing clubs and the type of things that you need to do on a sailing ship, the type of activities and that kind of thing that goes on.
So, Rosemary, as a disabled person, can you tell us a little bit about what lockdown's been like for you?
Well, I'm a wheelchair user. I've got a spinal condition, so I've been disabled from birth. Lockdown, it's been very frustrating. I haven't been shielding because I don't have any underlying health issues around diabetes or respiratory problems or anything like that. So it's been myself and my husband here, both working from home. It's been frustrating not being able to get out and about and kind of meet friends and meet up with friends and things like that. But yeah, it's probably similar to many people. It's been frustrating.
I'm sure it has. And I know you have been getting out and about. You've been doing those, the essential shopping and getting out for some fresh air from time to time. What's your experience of that been, and what's been the reaction of other people when they've seen you out and about?
I've been out and about a little bit, not too much, I have to say, but I think there's an assumption. I've had people sort of come up to me and ask me, am I all right? Should I be out? Shouldn't I be shielding and stuff like this? And I've sort of explained, no, I don't have any underlying health risks, so I'm not any more kind of at risk of COVID than anyone else. I think it's one of the things that's been a little bit difficult is some of the things have been put in place to keep people, walking in the right direction, and sort of increased cycle lanes and things has made it difficult to actually get around. So the sort of interim measures they've put in, the ramps aren't really very safe. The distance that I have to kind of move around has been curtailed somewhat. Yeah, it's a little bit concerning as to what people have to. Firstly, the high accessibility measures are going to be affected by the physical distancing rules, and just sort of people's assumptions about disabled people that we're all much more likely to be susceptible to something like COVID, which of course we're not. But that's going to take a while to just keep reinforcing that.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's really interesting. It's both the assumptions and also interesting that everyone's adapting the way we operate, and actually just remembering to think about what's that going to mean for some accessibility features. That's such an important part of what sailing clubs, because sailing clubs are going through exactly the same thing. They're having to kind of rearrange how people move around boat parks and slipways, and you're accessing toilets and things like that. So still remembering that accessibility is incredibly important. But as you touched on there, that not everybody who's a disabled person is at higher risk of COVID, but we know some people are at higher risk of a serious illness from if they do catch COVID. And the term vulnerable has been linked to this in some of the terminology. We hear about clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable people. And as you say, not every disabled person is at higher risk. But how do you feel about that word vulnerable?
I think it's really dangerous that it's being used as a kind of a term to apply to so many people. And it's sort of generally used to kind of disabled people are vulnerable, and disabled people are not vulnerable. If you don't put the proper measures in place, then anyone can become vulnerable. But it has been used as a kind of just a word to describe everybody. And I think the problem with using a word like vulnerable is that it gets people worried. Oh my goodness, that person's vulnerable. Well, they're not. They're disabled. Some of them might be vulnerable, but they will be the expert on how they're vulnerable. So I would always say, ask the person, what way they want to be sort of supported, or have they been advised by their doctor, for example, that they should be shielding or should be avoiding certain things. But I think, as I say, using terms like vulnerable, it's not very positive. It's it doesn't make you want to kind of include that person terribly much. So I would avoid it.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think clearly it's used very specifically in some of the government definitions and guidance and advice. But when it's used as a catch-all phrase, that's when it starts having a bit of a negative impact. So it sounds like you don't go sailing so much anymore, and I know you're an activist in the kind of political sense, but what keeps you active physically these days?
Well, because I haven't been out and about as much, you know me, I wheel myself around everywhere, usually. Because I haven't been doing so much of that, I've started up a little exercise regime at home. In my younger days, I used to be, I was a Paralympian in my much younger days. I used to race a lot in my wheelchair and do kind of discus and javelin and things.
So clearly, as an ex-Paralympian, you've got lots of experience of organisations and sports clubs trying to provide inclusive activities. Just to finish, when organisations get it right, when they're genuinely inclusive, what is it that you think they're doing right? What are the few key things for you that mean they're getting it right?
The best thing is to go somewhere and not notice the accessibility. You don't notice things. No one makes a fuss about it. You're just kind of, almost as though your access needs are forgotten about because they've been met. Whereas I've been to other places where there was great access, but it was just there. It was just a matter of course, this is what we do. Of course, it's what we do, and it's been more welcoming. So I think what you're trying to do is you're trying to provide a welcoming atmosphere, because It's one thing to have access, it's quite another thing to be welcomed. So, you know, no one has all the answers, but the only way you can improve what you're offering in the setting that you're talking about is to ask questions, which are not sometimes easy questions to ask.
Absolutely, and I think that, you know, you touch on some really important points there around these are difficult times, and encouraging people to get out and about again, and particularly those who might need more support to get back on the water. It does take that welcoming attitude. It does take asking and thinking about it, because if we don't think about it, and if we don't ask the right questions, we're not going to make it happen. So, Rosemary, that's been brilliant. Thank you very much. If you ever want to go sailing again, do get in touch. I'm sure we can find the right place for you to get you in a boat, and remind you what life on the ocean waves is like.
Thank you very much.
Joff, that's been really interesting. I've enjoyed talking to you about this, but just as we start to wrap up, I wonder if you could have a go at giving us, I don't know, a couple of key points to leave our audience on.
Yeah, absolutely, Gareth. You know, first of all, naturally, any club should be prohibiting anyone who knows that they've got COVID-19 symptoms from attending your premises. This clearly wouldn't be discriminatory, and it's in everyone's best interests. You may wish to advise those in higher risk groups to consider very carefully whether their attendance at the club is prudent in their circumstances, but ultimately that's a decision for them, you know, with the full knowledge of everything that the club is doing to protect people. However, what we don't recommend is prohibiting those in higher risk groups from attending the club, because that's the bit that might inadvertently result in some discrimination. You know, so we're advising against blanket policies containing any sort of age or disability restrictions, or any of the other protected characteristics, of course. And we advise to think about and plan for all of your members who may need additional support to get back on the water or back involved in club life at a time that's right for them. So I guess those would be my key points, key takeaways.
Brilliant, thank you. And just to add to that, you know, we absolutely recognise that clubs will have concerns about potential exposure for liability if someone catches or allegedly catches the virus at their premises at the clubhouse, particularly as they cannot guarantee that participants will not be exposed to the virus at the premises. It's so difficult. However, provided you as a club meet your duty of care to implement those COVID-19 safety measures that we talked about and ensure that they're enforced and, importantly, regularly reviewed, it's highly unlikely that you'll be held liable for a possible contracting of the virus at the premises. And you know, just to add to that as well, I suppose, additionally, as far as the club environment is concerned, members assume an element of risk themselves by the act of taking part. It's not just the club, it's both parties are involved. Brilliant. Look, if you have any questions about the areas that we've covered today, please drop us an email to sport.development@rya.org.uk. We'd love to hear from you. But really importantly, thanks for listening. Stay safe. Don't forget to subscribe, and do check out all the information available to clubs in the Return to Boating section of the RYA website. Thanks.
Thanks, Gareth.